Hey everybody, my name is Alex, and in this video we are doing part 4 of our Ultimate Autonomous Guide. We will be prepping the drives in this one. So there's a few ways that you can have your drive set up. The first one is a dedicated SSD where you format and use the whole drive. I highly recommend this whenever you get into dealing with disks and partitioning things and just using specific folders. It always is a little bit nerve-wracking and can get messy. So if you can, and not everybody has this option, but if you can, I recommend dedicating an entire SSD. What I actually use on the computer that I am doing this guide for is a USB-C external NVMe drive enclosure. I'll put a link to that. I don't know how many of these you really want to run, but I found it as a really easy way to just add more space without having to have slots on my motherboard or take up a PCIe slot. I can just throw it in this external USB-C enclosure, connect it to my computer, and get it running pretty quickly. You could also partition off a section of the drive. This is typically a bit safer than using like a folder. I'm not going to go over how to do that, but it is an option. I don't really recommend it. And you could also just create a folder on a drive. So I don't recommend this either, but you could just create, like Autonomous farm folder, and then you'll mount that folder. I mean, we're going to be mounting folders anyway, so you would just mount that folder into your farm and make sure you use the correct size, like however big you want your farm. Because if you make the farm too large for the drive, you might run out of space. It could cause like some corruption. So this is why it's best to just dedicate an entire drive if you can possibly do it. And I would really highly discourage using your operating system drive for your autonomous farm. Maybe for like a node, maybe for like a cache, but definitely not for the farm drive. There just might be some issues either with your operating system or actually getting rewards. And then just a warning, anytime you're going to be formatting things, deleting partitions, you could lose data. So it's always better to err on the side of caution when you're making big changes like that. So double check everything that you're doing. The guide is actually going to be, it's based on my main computer, Terminator, but what I show in this video is actually going to be the Ubuntu desktop computer that I use daily, which is Bender. I just have a single 2 TB drive on here. Like I said, it's a USB-C enclosure, and even though it's an NVMe, you're going to see the name has SDA in it, and I think it's kind of a good example because you can see if you have an NVMe SSD, it's going to show up for the name, it's going to show NVMe, but if you have like a SATA SSD, it's going to show up as SD something, and you'll see this when we jump into it. So the first thing we're going to want to do is identify the drives. So if we bring our terminal up here, I'm going to do my first command of lsblk. Now, we got a lot going on here. We have all these loops. You can ignore the loops. And the first one we have is NVMe 1N1. And we can see that it's already mounted. It's has like a boot partition or a boot, mount point. Anything like that, we're going to want to leave alone. And very similar, like with this down here, this NVMe 0 and 1. Again, I know that I have 2 NVMe drives. One is a Windows, that's probably this one, and one is um, my actual Ubuntu installation. So I'm going to leave those alone. I'm not going to touch those. What I want is this SDA. And because it was a USB enclosure, it actually mounted it automatically, but I don't want it to be mounted automatically. So the first thing I'm going to do, this isn't in the guide, but if your drive mounts automatically, you can do sudo umount dev. So I'm always prefixing the name with dev and then SDA. And now if I do lsblk, I can see that there's no mount point anymore. It's just listed as SDA. There's no partitions, but if you were going to delete partitions, you would just simply open it up in fdisk. So we can do sudo fdisk dev sda, and this isn't formatted in ext4, so that's why it's giving me this error. But here we could remove the partitions. You would just do the D key, but we can see there's no partitions. And then after you press D, you would just confirm to delete the partition. If you have multiple, you would just go through the process of hitting D multiple times until all the partitions are gone. And then, I don't know, is it Q? Yeah, Q to exit. And the idea is you don't want to have any partitions on this. You could do a single partition if you wanted, but there's really no need because this is a dedicated autonomous disk. So let's clear this out and let's go to the next step, which is actually formatting the drive. So I'm going to do sudo mkfs, so make file system is probably what it means, -t for type, ext4, and we're going to do dev SDA. Now yours might not be SDA, it might be SDB, or it might be SDD, or it might be NVMe 0 and 1. So depending on the device, you want to just make sure when you do lsblk, you're choosing the correct one. So I'm going to do sudo make file system -t ext4 dev SDA. Now we can see that it was last mounted, September 7th. It contains a file system, but I'm going to reformat it basically. I'm going to recreate this file system. So I'm going to hit Y, and it's going to go ahead and start doing that. And mine's pretty quick, but depending on the size and depending on the throughput, like it could take a little bit for you to format that. Now, if we do lsblk, we can see or let's try lsblk-f. Okay, it doesn't show us. I was going to show you the difference in size, but I think you have to actually mount it. What we're going to do is remove reserved space. So typically, on like your system drives, there's some reserved space for root, file system, and there's some other things that get reserved. We don't need that if it's a dedicated drive. So I'm going to do sudo tune 2fs-r0. That's like reserve space set to 0, dev SDA. And we can see it's setting reserve block count to 0. And this actually adds, a good percentage of space back to my drive. It's still going to say 1.8, but if we had mounted it and it showed the available space, it would be more than before we ran that, setting the reserve space to 0. Okay, now we want to mount the drives. And in order to mount the drives, we need to have a folder to mount the drive to. And I prefer, this is a lot of preferences, but for me, I mount all my drives to /media, and then I create an autonomous folder. So I'm going to do sudo make dir media autonomous. So first I need to create the autonomous folder, and then I'm going to do sudo make dir media autonomous, and then I'm going to do, I only have one drive. So if I had multiple drives, I like to start from 0, so I create a 00 folder, then I do 01, then 02. Some people like farm 00 just to be a little bit more explicit. It's really up to you how you want to name your drives, but for every dedicated drive you have, you would want to create a folder. So I'm just going to do actually farm 00 this time and create that. And that is where I'm going to mount my drive. Again, you need to create a folder for every single drive you want to mount. So if, in the guide, I show, I run 0001, and then later on you're going to see that in my FS tab, I am mounting each drive to each folder individually. So if you have lots of drives, you're going to need to do a little bit of repetition. That's why for this guide, I'm just using a different computer because that way it's just one drive. So we have the mount point created. Now we need to get the UUID for the drive because we need our UUID to create our FS tab file so that the drives mount automatically when you restart the computer. So I could do like sudo mount dev SDA, and then I could put media autonomous farm 0, and I could mount the drive. In fact, let's just do it right now. And now if I do lsblk, we could see that it's mounted just fine. You could do this, but if I restart my computer, it's not going to automatically mount. So we need to add it to the FS tab. So I'm going to do sudo umount dev sda, and that's going to unmount the drive. And let's get the UUID. So we can do lsblk. We've been running that, but we're going to do a -f, and that will give me this UUID. So I'm going to copy that. And typically, if I have a lot of drives, I'll just copy this and put it in. I'll copy all of them and put it in a notepad, and then I'll just be copying and pasting the UUIDs because you don't want to type that out. That's crazy. And then we're going to go into our FS tab. So sudo nano etc FS tab. And I'm going to leave I'm just going to page down to the bottom because we leave everything at the top alone. And I'm going to create a little Autonomys section here. And I'm going to type this out. But again, if you have lots of drives, it's best to just like do a lot of copy paste type stuff. Do everything in a notepad and then copy and paste the entire file back in like the text part back into your FS tab. This is why it's beneficial to SSH into your farm computer because trying to like type everything out is like horrible. I'm sure like people that are really good with command line stuff, like they could probably, they know all the commands to like copy paste things and stuff. I'm not that sophisticated when it comes to CLI. I rely on the GUI a lot. But what we're going to do is add in an entry. So UUID equals, and then I'm going to paste that UUID. And then I'm going to do a tab, and then I'm going to say, I want that to be mounted to media Autonomys 00. And then my file system is ext4. We're going to use defaults. So these are just flags we're setting for the drive when it gets mounted. We're going to do no A time, and it reduces wear on your drive. I don't know if it's like a noticeable amount, but it's not a bad idea to just include no A time and then no fail. And no fail means if I were to disconnect this USB drive and restart my computer, it wouldn't boot because that drive is missing. So no fail just means if the drive's not there, still boot the computer. It's not a big deal. Then 0, 0. And I think that's like the order. It has something to do with like the order. I don't really know. I just put 0, 0. Doesn't really matter. And then we can do Control X, Y, Enter. And to make sure that this is going to work when you reboot your computer, you can do sudo mount, and then we're going to do AV. So basically it's going to go into your FS tab and it's going to execute it and do it verbosely. So the V is for verbose, A means like mount all the stuff in there. Oops, that's because, okay, so I put in the wrong folder. So if you do get an error like this, just read the error. I put in the wrong folder here, so let's just go back in. And I think I did farm00 if I remember correctly. This is what I get for changing what I typically do. Okay, so we can see it was successfully mounted. If we do lsblk-f, we can see the mount point is here, and we can even do df-h, and that's going to show that we have dev SDA, we have 1.8 terabytes, and it's been mounted to this folder here. And we're going to need these mount points because in the next section, when we deploy our cluster, we're going to be mounting each drive to our Docker container, and that's so that our farm has access to it. But for our farm to have access to it, we need to set up the permissions correctly. So in order to do that, we're going to change the ownership of these folders. I only have one, but the command that I run will change the permission for all of the folders that you would create if you have multiple drives to be nobody and no group. So literally, we're changing the ownership to nobody and the group to no group. So let's do sudo chown, so change ownership, -R, nobody and no group. And then we're going to do media Autonomous and then an asterisk here. So it's going to be for every folder, every subfolder in the Autonomous directory here. And now if I do ls-l media Autonomous, we can see farm0, permissions are set to nobody and no group. Okay, that's it. Our drive is ready to be mounted to our Docker container for our farm cluster, and we're going to do that in the next video. So don't forget to subscribe, Substack, YouTube. That way you'll get notified for when the next video launches. It should be, I might even do it today, we'll see. But I will see you in the next video.